Williams smiled at her the way he used to smile at me. That was the first thought that crossed my mind when the elevator doors opened. I almost called his name. My hand was already halfway up before I realized he wasn't alone. The woman standing beside him reached over and brushed something off his jacket. He looked down at her, smiled without thinking, and for a second they seemed completely unaware the rest of the world existed. Then he rested his hand lightly against the small of her back as they walked toward the cafe across the street. I didn't run after them. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there holding the grocery bag I'd stopped to buy on my way home, trying to understand why a gesture that innocent felt more painful than if I'd caught him kissing someone. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. Stephanie used to think the strongest marriages were the quiet ones. Not the couples who flooded social media with anniversary tributes or surprised each other with expensive vacations every few months. The marriages she admired were smaller than that. They lived inside ordinary routines. Someone remembered to buy milk without being asked. Someone filled the gas tank because they knew the other person had an early morning. Someone made coffee first, even if they never had time to drink it. That was the kind of marriage she believed she had with Williams. Most mornings in their Los Angeles home began almost the same way. She usually woke first, not because she wanted to, but because years of working in human resources had trained her body to wake before the alarm. By the time sunlight reached the kitchen windows, she'd already watered the herbs sitting above the sink or started a load of laundry before getting ready for work. Williams wasn't much of a morning person. He'd stumble into the kitchen with his tie hanging around his neck instead of tied properly, open the cabinet without really looking inside, then ask the same question he'd asked at least twice a week. "Have you seen my keys?" Stephanie never answered right away. She'd sip her coffee, watch him check the same counter 3 different times, then point toward whatever impossible place he'd left them. "Top shelf." He'd look up. Sure enough, there they are. "I don't know how you lose things at eye level." "I don't lose them." She'd raise an eyebrow. "You temporarily relocate them?" He'd grin. "Exactly." That little exchange happened so often, neither of them thought much about it anymore. Looking back, she realized those tiny conversations had once carried more intimacy than either of them appreciated. Williams always made coffee before leaving the house. The strange thing was, he almost never stayed long enough to drink it. He'd pour 2 mugs, take 1 sip, glance at the time, apologize under his breath for running late again, then disappear toward another construction site somewhere across Southern California. The second mug usually sat cooling on the counter until Stephanie poured it into the sink before leaving for work herself. She never mentioned it. Some habits didn't need explanations. Their schedules rarely lined up perfectly. Stephanie managed human resources for a healthcare company downtown, where every day seemed to involve helping someone navigate conflict they wished didn't exist. A disagreement between coworkers, a complaint about a supervisor, someone trying to balance work with an aging parent, or a child who'd gotten sick overnight. People often apologized before telling her their problems. "I know you're busy. I hate bothering you. This is probably nothing." She'd smile. It doesn't have to be a disaster before it matters. Maybe that's why people trusted her. She listened before she judged. Sometimes she wondered whether she'd become so practiced at extending grace to everyone else that she'd started doing it automatically at home too. Not because Williams demanded it, because it felt easier to assume the best than to search for reasons not to. Williams loved his work, even when it exhausted him. As a commercial architect, he spent more time walking unfinished buildings than sitting behind a desk. His phone filled with blueprints, contractor messages, zoning updates, inspection photos, and reminders that seemed to arrive faster than he could answer them. When people asked what he did, he usually shrugged. "I draw buildings." Stephanie always laughed. "You leave out about 90% of your job." "I leave out the boring part." She'd tease him for pretending months of planning could be summarized in 1 sentence. He'd tease her for using phrases like organizational culture during everyday conversations. "You know, normal people say office." They're not the same thing. They are at dinner. She'd roll her eyes. No, they're really not. Those conversations never lasted long. They didn't have to. Comfort had replaced performance a long time ago. On weekends, they moved around each other almost instinctively. Saturday mornings belonged to grocery shopping, cleaning the house, and replacing whatever household item neither of them remembered running out of until it was gone. Paper towels, dish soap, laundry detergent. The arguments were so predictable, they barely counted as arguments. I bought detergent last time. No, you bought fabric softener. Same aisle. Very different bottle. Williams would eventually toss both into the shopping cart. There. Crisis solved. She'd laugh. You're impossible. And yet, you married me. I question that decision every time we're in this aisle. Neither of them meant it. Neither of them imagined those ordinary moments would someday become the memories Stephanie replayed most often. Funny how the mind worked. It rarely warned you which ordinary days would become precious later. Stephanie grew up believing marriage wasn't measured by excitement. Her parents had been married for 35 years before her father retired from driving city buses. Her mother spent decades working hospital shifts that changed every few weeks. Sometimes they passed each other in the kitchen like co-workers changing shifts. There were birthdays celebrated 2 days late because of work. Anniversaries that consisted of takeout containers and tired smiles. Christmas mornings where one parent slept after a night shift while the other assembled bicycles alone. None of it ever looked glamorous. It looked dependable. Her father still warmed her mother's car on cold mornings before she left for work. Her mother still packed him lunch even after he insisted she didn't have to. Neither of them made speeches about love. They simply kept showing up. Stephanie decided somewhere in her 20s that this was what successful marriage actually looked like. Not fireworks. Consistency. When she married Williams 4 years earlier, she'd never expected every season to feel exciting. In fact, she would have worried if it had. She believed excitement naturally settled into something steadier, something quieter, something that looked a lot like Tuesday night leftovers and arguing about whose turn it was to call the plumber. That belief became the foundation of her marriage. It also became the reason she missed things she probably shouldn't have. Not because she was naive, because she'd taught herself that routine was evidence everything was working. And for a long time, it honestly was. The first change didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself with a dramatic argument or a forgotten anniversary. It was so small, Stephanie almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Williams started answering questions with fewer words. That was all. At first, it barely registered. Long day? Yeah. Everything okay? You hungry? A little. Nothing about those answers sounded rude. He wasn't snapping at her. He wasn't avoiding her. He simply stopped expanding. The stories disappeared first. He used to come home with funny observations about impossible clients or contractors who insisted they could finish a month's work in a week. Sometimes he'd spend 15 minutes explaining why a staircase couldn't legally be moved 3 feet to the left because someone suddenly wanted bigger windows. Stephanie didn't understand architecture. She understood listening. Lately, those conversations had shrunk into summaries. Busy. Same as always. Nothing interesting. She assumed he was tired. Construction deadlines had a way of swallowing entire weeks. Stress made people quieter. She knew that better than most, so she didn't push. A few weeks later, she noticed something else. Williams ironed a shirt on Wednesday night. She paused while loading the dishwasher. You know that's one of your casual shirts, right? I know. You've worn it straight out of the dryer for years. He smiled without looking up. Figured I'd look a little more put together. She nodded. Looks nice. And that was the end of it. Or it should have been. Not long after that, she opened the bathroom cabinet looking for toothpaste and noticed a brand new bottle of cologne sitting where the old one used to be. She picked it up. The label looked familiar. Not because he'd worn it recently. Because he'd stopped wearing cologne almost 2 years earlier. You bought another bottle? Williams glanced over while drying his hands. Oh. Yeah. I thought you were done with that stuff. I don't know. He shrugged. Felt like wearing it again. She smiled. It smells good. He smiled back. Thanks. Nothing strange about a man buying cologne. Nothing strange about ironing shirts. Nothing strange about being tired. Individually, every change fit neatly inside a reasonable explanation. Stephanie had spent years helping employees avoid jumping to conclusions. She wasn't about to become the kind of spouse who treated every small difference like evidence of betrayal. Then came the coffee. One Tuesday evening, Williams leaned down to kiss her forehead after work. She laughed softly. "When did you start drinking caramel lattes?" He blinked. "What?" "You smell like caramel." He looked briefly confused before chuckling. "I don't drink caramel lattes." "I know. So, why do I smell like one?" He lifted his sleeve toward his face. "Huh." A second passed. "Must have been someone at work." "Probably." He kissed her forehead again. "What do you want for dinner?" The conversation drifted somewhere else. For him, it ended. For Stephanie, it lingered just a little longer. Not because she thought he'd lied, because she'd never known him to come home smelling like someone else's coffee. She caught herself thinking about it while chopping vegetables. Then she stopped herself. You're doing exactly what you tell other people not to do. Looking for meaning before you have facts. She let it go. At work, she saw what suspicion could do to relationships. A delayed text became proof of cheating. A forgotten errand became evidence of disrespect. People filled in blanks with fear until they believed stories that had never happened. Stephanie refused to live that way. If there was a reasonable explanation, she'd choose it first. Every time. Her friends certainly gave her no reason to think otherwise. During Thanksgiving dinner, her younger sister watched Stephanie and Williams clear plates together without speaking. "You two are weird." Stephanie laughed. "Why? You don't even have to ask each other what to do." Williams grinned. "I know better than to load the dishwasher wrong." "You've learned." Her sister shook her head. "I swear, you two never fight. It's almost annoying." Everyone laughed. Stephanie laughed too. She didn't say what crossed her mind a second later. Not fighting wasn't always the same thing as talking. That thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. She replaced it with another reasonable explanation. They were busy. Life was busy. Marriage changed. That was normal. Wasn't it? The question wasn't asked during a serious conversation. It wasn't meant to change anything. In fact, the woman who asked it probably forgot she'd said it before the workday was over. Stephanie didn't. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, after a department meeting that had gone 20 minutes longer than anyone wanted. People drifted toward the conference room door with paper coffee cups and laptops tucked under their arms, already talking about deadlines waiting for them upstairs. Stephanie stayed behind to gather the handouts left scattered across the table. "Need a hand?" She looked up. It was Marissa, one of the HR specialists on her team. "I've got it." Marissa bent down anyway, stacking a few folders. "You always say that." Stephanie smiled. "I know." For a minute, neither of them said much. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from spending enough years around someone to stop feeling like every quiet moment needed filling. Then Marissa spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" Stephanie glanced over. "Sure. When was the last time you and Williams actually spent an entire day together?" Stephanie answered automatically. "Oh, we spend time together. I mean, a whole day." Marissa shrugged, almost apologetic. No work emails, no phone calls, no one rushing somewhere. Stephanie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried to picture a Saturday. One blurred into another. There had been grocery shopping, laundry, cleaning the house, a dinner with friends, Williams taking a call from a contractor while they were driving, her answering emails after breakfast because someone had called in sick. She kept searching. A vacation? No. Even then, Williams had taken 2 conference calls from the hotel balcony while she answered messages from her director before lunch. Marissa noticed the silence. "I didn't mean anything by it." Stephanie smiled quickly. "I know. It's just..." "Oh." Marissa leaned against the conference table. "My husband and I realized we'd become roommates with matching calendars." Stephanie laughed softly. "That's specific." "It was true." "What did you do?" "We started scheduling days together." Stephanie raised an eyebrow. You scheduled quality time? We had to. Marissa smiled. If we'd waited until life slowed down, we'd still be waiting. Stephanie nodded politely. The conversation ended there. A few minutes later, they walked back to their offices. By the time she reached her desk, emails had already pushed the exchange into the background. At least, she thought they had. Driving home that evening, the question found her again. When was the last time we spent a whole day together? Not in the same house. Not eating dinner while watching separate screens. Not folding laundry between phone calls. A day. She honestly couldn't remember. That surprised her more than it should have. She told herself memory was unreliable. People forgot things. Life became repetitive. That didn't mean anything was wrong. Still, she noticed herself reaching for examples to prove the question didn't matter. Last month, they'd gone out for dinner. Although Williams had spent most of the meal answering messages from a contractor whose project had fallen behind schedule. Before that, they'd gone to Stephanie's parents' anniversary celebration, but they'd spent most of the afternoon talking with relatives instead of each other. Christmas? Half the day had disappeared because Williams needed to review revised construction drawings before Monday morning. None of those examples felt like answers. They felt like exceptions that somehow proved the question instead. Williams was already home when she arrived. His laptop sat open on the dining table. Blueprints covered half the surface. He looked up when she walked inside. Hey, you eat yet? She shook her head. I thought we'd order something. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've got about 30 more minutes. No rush. She carried groceries into the kitchen while he returned to his screen. Neither of them thought that was unusual. It had become normal. She unpacked vegetables, started rinsing grapes, loaded yogurt into the refrigerator. Behind her, she could hear the quiet tapping of laptop keys. Occasionally, Williams muttered something under his breath while reviewing drawings. At one point, he sighed. You okay? She asked. Yeah. What happened? Just dealing with revisions. She nodded. What kind? He hesitated. Oh. Another pause. Parking layout. She waited for him to continue. He didn't. That struck her, not because she'd cared about parking layouts, because Williams used to explain things she barely understood anyway. Now every answer seemed determined to arrive in its smallest possible form. She looked over her shoulder. He wasn't hiding anything. He wasn't acting nervous. He simply looked tired. She accepted that explanation because she wanted to. Dinner arrived 40 minutes later. They ate on the couch. A television show played that neither of them was really watching. Every so often, one of them laughed at a joke they'd barely heard. Halfway through the episode, Williams reached for his phone. Stephanie glanced at him. He noticed. Work. I figured. He answered 2 messages. Set the phone down. 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. This time, he silenced it without looking. She appreciated that more than she expected. He caught her smiling. What? Nothing. What? She shook her head. I was just thinking. Dangerous. She laughed. Very. The conversation faded again. Not because either of them was upset. Because they'd become remarkably good at letting conversations end before they became conversations. A week later, Stephanie met her younger sister for lunch. Her sister arrived 10 minutes late, dropped into the chair across from her, and immediately apologized. The twins refused to wear matching shoes. Stephanie laughed. That's a new one. They're 5. Logic isn't really part of the process. After they ordered, the conversation wandered through family updates, work frustrations, and plans for their mother's birthday. Eventually, her sister asked, How's Williams? Busy. Still living at construction sites? Pretty much. Her sister stirred her iced tea. You miss him? Stephanie smiled. He's not deployed. You know what I mean. She did. She considered the question longer than necessary. I think we're both just tired. Tired can last a long time. Stephanie looked down at the table. We're okay. I know. Her sister reached across and squeezed her hand. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. Stephanie smiled. I know. And she meant it. No one around her was accusing Williams of anything. No one was planting suspicion. People were simply asking ordinary questions she'd stopped asking herself. That realization stayed with her longer than she liked. Not because it proved anything, because it exposed something she'd quietly accepted. She and Williams no longer asked each other many questions, not real ones. Their conversations revolved around logistics. Who's picking up groceries? Did the electric bill get paid? What time will you be home? Do we need paper towels? Somewhere along the way, curiosity had slowly been replaced by coordination. Neither of them had noticed when it happened. Or maybe they had. Maybe they'd both assumed they'd ask the important questions later, when work calmed down, when deadlines eased, when life became less demanding. Except life never made that promise. Monday came and went. Then Tuesday arrived. It looked like every other Tuesday. Stephanie left home a little after 7. Williams had already gone. His coffee mug still sat beside the sink with a thin ring of coffee at the bottom, evidence that he'd once again made it but never finished it. She smiled to herself while rinsing it. Some habits never changed. Traffic into downtown Los Angeles crawled as usual. She answered emails, met with employees, helped resolve a disagreement between 2 department supervisors who'd somehow turned a scheduling issue into a personal feud. By lunchtime, she was thinking about grocery shopping. They needed milk, eggs, paper towels. She even made herself a short list on her phone. Nothing about the day felt different. Nothing hinted that before the sun went down, one ordinary stop on her way home would leave her looking at her marriage through completely different eyes. She didn't know it then. She couldn't have. Because the biggest changes in our lives rarely arrive with a warning. Sometimes they begin on an afternoon that looks exactly like every other one. The email came a little after 1. Afternoon leadership meeting canceled. Please use the remaining time to complete department priorities. Stephanie read it twice, mostly because canceled meetings almost never happened. She looked at the clock. If she finished the employee reports waiting on her desk, she could leave nearly an hour earlier than usual. It felt like finding money in an old coat pocket. She spent the next 45 minutes clearing emails, approving vacation requests, and returning 2 phone calls she'd been putting off since Monday. By the time she shut her laptop, most of the office was still working. You disappearing already? Marissa asked as Stephanie picked up her bag. Looks like it. I'm jealous. Stephanie laughed. So am I. Outside, the afternoon sun had burned through the morning haze. Los Angeles looked exactly the way it usually did. Traffic inching forward, people carrying iced coffees, cyclists weaving between cars like they trusted everyone more than they should. She slid into her car and glanced at the grocery list on her phone. Milk, eggs, paper towels. She smiled. Paper towels again. Williams was going to claim he'd already bought them. She was already preparing her argument. Halfway home, she remembered a specialty kitchen store near the financial district. The herb planter she'd kept above the sink for years had cracked over the weekend, and she'd promised herself she'd replace it before another Saturday slipped by. The store wasn't far from Williams's office. She checked the time. Still early. Without thinking much about it, she took the next exit. The shop was small, tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. She found a simple ceramic planter in less than 10 minutes, paid for it, and stepped back onto the sidewalk carrying a paper bag that felt lighter than she'd expected. She looked toward the office towers across the street. Williams worked only a couple of blocks away. Her phone was already in her hand before she'd fully decided what she was doing. She opened his contact. Want to grab a coffee? I'm nearby. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she imagined him in the middle of a meeting, or standing on a construction site with contractors waiting for answers. He'd apologize. Tell her he wished he could. Promise they'd do it another day. She smiled to herself and locked the phone. Another day. That phrase had become strangely familiar. She slipped the phone back into her purse and started walking toward the parking garage. The elevator doors opened into the lobby of the building where she'd parked. She stepped out. At first, she wasn't looking for anyone. She was thinking about traffic, whether she should stop for groceries before heading home, whether they still had enough coffee beans for the morning. Then she heard someone laugh, not loudly, but easily. The sound made her turn without thinking. Across the glass entrance, standing outside near the curb, was Williams. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms, and his tie had disappeared. He looked lighter, like someone who'd finally reached the weekend after a long week. Standing beside him was a woman Stephanie had never seen before. She looked to be around their age, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, navy blazer, canvas tote bag hanging from one shoulder. They weren't standing unusually close. Nothing about the distance between them looked intimate. The woman said something Stephanie couldn't hear. Williams laughed, not politely, not the quick smile he gave clients. He tipped his head back for a second, the corners of his eyes narrowing the way they always had when something genuinely amused him. Stephanie felt herself stop walking. The woman reached toward him. For one brief moment, Stephanie thought she was going to hug him. Instead, she brushed a tiny piece of lint from the front of his shirt. Williams looked down. "Thanks," he seemed to say. The woman smiled. He smiled back. Neither appeared self-conscious. Neither looked around. Then, as they started toward the cafe across the street, Williams rested his hand lightly against the small of her back to guide her through a group of pedestrians crossing between them. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, 4 at most. His hand disappeared as soon as they reached the sidewalk. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously romantic, nothing she could point to and say, "There." That's the moment everything became clear. Because nothing was clear. She stood perfectly still until the pedestrian signal changed. By the time her feet remembered how to move again, they were already halfway across the street. Stephanie didn't decide to follow them. Her body simply started moving before she'd made up her mind. She stayed on the opposite side of the street, weaving through lunchtime foot traffic without taking her eyes off the pair ahead. The cafe wasn't hidden away. It sat on the corner beneath a row of office buildings where people in business clothes drifted in and out all afternoon. Williams held the door open. The woman walked in first. Stephanie slowed before reaching the entrance. She told herself she could still leave, drive home, forget she'd ever come this way. Instead, she stepped inside. The cafe was crowded enough that no one paid attention to her. She moved toward the back, pretending to study the pastry display while searching the room without making it obvious. Then she found them. They'd taken a small table near the window, not tucked away, not hidden. If anything, they looked like 2 co-workers escaping the office for 30 minutes. A server brought water. Williams thanked her. The woman said something that made him laugh again. Stephanie couldn't remember the last time she'd heard him laugh twice in the same conversation. He leaned forward while listening, not distracted, not checking his phone, not glancing toward the door every few seconds. Completely present. The woman spoke with animated hands. At one point, she rolled her eyes dramatically. Williams laughed so hard he covered part of his face with one hand. Stephanie blinked. She'd forgotten he even did that. He'd always covered his mouth when something genuinely caught him off guard. Years ago, she'd teased him about it. "You laugh like you're trying to hide evidence." He'd smiled. "My mother said it was bad manners." "You believed her?" "I was 8. Watching him now felt strangely familiar and strangely foreign at the same time. She wasn't seeing a different man. She was seeing a version of her husband she'd almost forgotten existed. That hurt more than she expected. Not because another woman was making him laugh, because she'd stopped wondering what made him laugh at all. The server placed 2 drinks on the table. One was black coffee, the other, a caramel latte. Stephanie looked at the cup. Then, at Williams. He wasn't drinking it. The woman was. An uncomfortable thought crossed her mind. Maybe she'd been wrong that evening. Maybe the caramel scent she'd noticed weeks earlier had come from standing beside someone else. The possibility should have made her feel better. Instead, it somehow made the afternoon feel even more confusing. Nothing fit together. Nothing proved anything. They never touched, never leaned into each other, never behaved like people trying to hide a relationship. If anything, they looked comfortable enough not to think about appearances. That was almost harder to understand. Stephanie checked the time. Almost 20 minutes had passed. She suddenly imagined Williams looking up and seeing her across the room. She pictured the awkward explanation. "What are you doing here?" "First, saw you outside. So, you followed me?" The thought embarrassed her. She wasn't someone who followed her husband. She wasn't someone who searched for evidence. She wasn't someone who wanted to become suspicious, Before either of them looked in her direction, she turned and walked out of the cafe. She never ordered anything. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. Traffic gave her too much time to think. She tried replaying what she'd seen. Each time it ended the same way. Nothing inappropriate, nothing undeniable, nothing she could accuse him of. She hated that her mind kept returning to one detail anyway. The way he'd looked while listening. Not smiling, listening, like nowhere else mattered for those few minutes. She reached home before Williams. The grocery bags sat untouched on the kitchen counter while she stood staring out the window above the sink. Twice she picked up her phone. Twice she put it back down. She considered calling him, asking, "How's your afternoon going?" Instead, she started dinner. Cutting vegetables felt easier than choosing words. By the time Williams came through the front door, the pasta water was already boiling. He stepped inside carrying his laptop bag. Hey. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. The familiar gesture landed differently now. Something smells good. I'm keeping expectations realistic. He laughed softly. Smart. He washed his hands while she stirred the sauce. For a few minutes they moved around the kitchen the way they always had, passing each other without bumping into one another, reaching for drawers almost by instinct. Then Stephanie spoke. So. Williams looked up. How was your day? He opened the refrigerator. Busy. She waited. He took out a bottle of water. Long meetings. Another pause. Anything interesting happen? He twisted the cap off the bottle. Not really. He took a drink. Mostly revisions. That was it. No mention of leaving the office. No mention of lunch. No mention of the woman. Stephanie watched him for another second before turning back to the stove. Mine was pretty quiet. That's good. He smiled at her. The same warm, familiar smile she'd seen thousands of times. Only now she found herself wondering how many versions of that smile existed. Dinner passed comfortably enough that anyone watching would have called them happy. They talked about grocery prices, a contractor who kept delaying a project, one of Stephanie's employees finally returning from maternity leave. Nothing unusual, nothing tense, nothing that sounded like a marriage in trouble. After they cleaned the kitchen, Williams settled onto the couch with his laptop. Stephanie curled up in the opposite corner with a book. Neither read very much. Around 9:30, Williams closed the computer. I'm exhausted. I know. He disappeared down the hallway. Stephanie remained on the couch for another 10 minutes. Not because she wanted to avoid him, because she was trying to make one decision. She could walk into the bedroom and ask a simple question. Who were you having coffee with today? Instead, she turned off the living room lamp. For the first time in 7 years, she carried something into their marriage that she chose not to share. It wasn't proof. It wasn't an accusation. It was only a question. But questions have a way of changing a relationship long before they're ever spoken aloud. Stephanie didn't wake up the next morning suspicious. She woke up determined to prove herself wrong. On the drive to work, she replayed the afternoon outside the cafe one last time and made herself a promise. Don't turn one confusing moment into a story. She meant it. For the next few days, she went out of her way to behave normally. She texted Williams around lunch, "Hope your meeting goes well." A few minutes later, he replied, "Thanks. Busy day. Talk later." Nothing unusual. That was exactly how he'd answered for months. The difference was that now she found herself wondering what busy actually meant. She hated that thought as soon as it arrived. The first canceled plan happened that Friday. They'd agreed to meet at a small Italian restaurant near their neighborhood after work. Nothing fancy. A place they'd been visiting long enough that the owner greeted them by name. Stephanie left the office on time for once. She was halfway there when her phone buzzed. Williams, I'm so sorry. Client issue. Can't get away. Rain check? She stared at the message while waiting at a red light. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. No problem. Hope everything works out. She sent it before she could overthink it. Then she pulled into the restaurant parking lot anyway. Not because she expected him to appear. Because she'd already driven there. The hostess smiled when she walked in. Just one tonight? Stephanie hesitated. Yeah. She sat in the same booth they usually shared. Halfway through dinner, She caught herself looking toward the entrance when the door opened. She laughed under her breath. He'd already told her he wasn't coming. Still, some part of her kept expecting him to walk in, apologizing. He didn't. The following week brought smaller things. Williams began answering emails after they'd gone to bed. The glow from his laptop lit one side of the bedroom, while Stephanie pretended to be asleep. She heard the soft tapping of keys. Occasionally his phone vibrated. Sometimes he stepped into the hallway before taking a call. Not every call, only some. When he returned, he'd slide back into bed carefully, trying not to wake her. She kept her breathing steady. He always assumed she was asleep. One night, she opened her eyes after he settled beside her. "You coming to bed?" "I am now." "What time is it?" He glanced toward the clock. "Almost midnight." "Everything okay?" He rubbed his face. "Project's behind." She nodded. "Need any help?" He smiled tiredly. "Unless you've secretly become an architect. I was hoping you'd lower your standards." He laughed. Tempting. Then he kissed her forehead. The conversation ended. Nothing about it felt dishonest. It simply felt incomplete. By the middle of the month, Stephanie noticed something she wished she hadn't. Williams had become unpredictable in ways that didn't match the man she'd known. Not his personality, his schedule. He'd say he expected to be home by 6, then text at 7:30, running late. Sometimes he'd arrive at 8, sometimes closer to 9. When she asked how the project was going, he'd always have an answer. The answers simply never became stories anymore. Before, she would have accepted that without another thought. Now every small inconsistency landed beside the memory of the cafe. One detail alone meant nothing. Together, they refused to stay separate. That bothered her more than the details themselves. She had built an entire career on avoiding assumptions. Now she caught herself assembling them. One afternoon, Marissa stopped beside Stephanie's office. "You look tired." Stephanie smiled. "Do I?" "You've read the same paragraph 3 times. Stephanie looked down. Marissa wasn't wrong. "You want coffee?" Stephanie almost said yes. Instead, she shook her head. "I'm okay." Marissa studied her for another second. "Everything all right at home?" There it was. The question Stephanie had been hoping no one would ask. She answered too quickly. "Yeah." Marissa nodded once. "If you ever need to vent." "I know." After she left, Stephanie leaned back in her chair. She realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't protecting Williams from other people's opinions. She was protecting the version of her marriage she'd spent years believing in. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Stephanie saw her again. This time, she wasn't looking. Her company had partnered with another healthcare organization for a leadership workshop at a conference center downtown. Stephanie arrived early, picked up her name badge, and found herself waiting near the registration tables while attendees filtered inside. She reached for a bottle of water. Someone nearby laughed. Not Williams, the woman. Stephanie turned instinctively. The same navy blazer, the same loose ponytail. Only this time, the woman wasn't alone. Williams stood beside her. His back was partly turned. They hadn't noticed Stephanie. The woman handed him a thick folder. "I wasn't sure you'd make it," Stephanie heard her say. Williams smiled. "I almost didn't." "You always say that." "I usually mean it." They both laughed. Stephanie remained where she was, hidden partly behind a display board advertising the conference schedule. Neither of them looked around. Neither acted secretive. If anything, they seemed completely comfortable being seen. Williams flipped through the folder. "I appreciate this. You don't have to thank me." "I do." The woman shrugged. "I owed you." Stephanie caught only those pieces. Nothing before them. Nothing after. Someone stepped between them carrying coffee, blocking her view. By the time the path cleared again, Williams and the woman were walking toward another hallway. She considered following. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was. A voice behind her interrupted. "Stephanie?" She turned. One of the workshop organizers smiled. "We're about to begin." She forced herself to smile back. "Coming?" For the rest of the morning, she struggled to focus. Words drifted past without staying. Leadership, communication, Organizational trust. The irony almost made her laugh. During lunch, she walked past the lobby hoping, though she wasn't sure why, to see them again. Nothing. She checked the outdoor seating area. Nothing. She told herself that should have been reassuring. Instead, it left her carrying another unfinished conversation in her head. I owed you. What did that mean? A project? A recommendation? A favor? None of those explanations sounded suspicious. Every explanation sounded possible. That was becoming the hardest part. If she'd caught Williams kissing someone, at least she'd know what she was dealing with. Instead, she had questions with no obvious direction. Driving home that evening, Stephanie surprised herself. She wasn't wondering whether Williams was having an affair. She was wondering whether she'd become the kind of person who could no longer trust her own instincts. Maybe she was inventing significance where none existed. Maybe she was connecting unrelated moments because one afternoon had unsettled her. The uncertainty was exhausting. She found herself wishing for clarity, even painful clarity. Anything felt easier than living inside possibilities. Williams noticed first, not what Stephanie had seen, only that something about her had changed. It happened on a Sunday morning. She was sitting at the kitchen table reading while he made pancakes. Normally she'd wander over, steal pieces before they reached the plate, and insist they tasted better that way. This morning, she stayed where she was. Williams carried breakfast over. You didn't try to steal any. She looked up. My pancakes. Oh. She smiled faintly. I guess I forgot. He sat down across from her. You never forget. She laughed, but it ended almost as quickly as it started. He studied her. You okay? I'm fine. You've been quiet. I've been working. So have I. She reached for the syrup. Exactly. He looked as though he wanted to ask something else. Instead, he picked up his fork. Over the next several days, they became unusually considerate of each other, almost careful. If Williams came home late, Stephanie didn't ask why. If Stephanie stayed at the office an extra hour, Williams didn't question it. They thanked each other for little things they used to take for granted. Could you hand me that? Thanks. Dinner was good. Appreciate it. See you in the morning. Nothing sounded wrong. That was the problem. Their marriage hadn't become hostile. It had become polite. One evening, Williams reached for her hand while they watched television. She let him hold it. After a minute, he gently squeezed her fingers. She squeezed back. Neither said anything. Neither knew they were trying to measure something neither could name. That night, after Williams had fallen asleep, Stephanie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the digital clock. She turned onto her side. Williams was asleep, facing away from her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder. She didn't. Not because she didn't want to, because she suddenly realized she no longer knew whether touch was the answer or another way of avoiding the questions between them. She closed her eyes. The image returned again. Williams laughing outside the office building. The woman brushing lint from his shirt. I owed you. His hand resting lightly against her back. None of it proved betrayal, but pretending she'd never seen it wasn't protecting her marriage anymore. It was protecting her fear of what the truth might be. The next morning, while Williams was still asleep, Stephanie stood in the kitchen holding her coffee. She picked up her phone, opened his contact, then closed it again. Not yet, but soon. For the first time since that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, she admitted something to herself without trying to soften it. Waiting wasn't helping. If their marriage was going to survive, whatever this was. Silence couldn't be the only thing they shared anymore. Stephanie didn't plan a confrontation. She planned a conversation. There was a difference. On Friday evening, Williams came home earlier than usual. He loosened his tie as he walked through the door and smiled when he saw her setting 2 plates on the dining table instead of eating in front of the television. Dinner at the table? She looked up. I thought we could. I like that. He disappeared long enough to wash his hands before joining her. For the first few minutes, they talked about ordinary things. An employee at Stephanie's office had finally accepted a promotion after weeks of refusing it. One of Williams's projects had passed an inspection he'd been worried about. They finished half the meal before Stephanie set down her fork. Can I ask you something? Williams looked at her. Sure. She kept her voice even. Have we been okay? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I don't know. She gave a small shrug. I've been thinking about us. We're fine. You answered that fast. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Because we are. Stephanie watched him for a moment. I miss talking to you. I talk to you. You tell me things. She shook her head gently. You don't really let me into them anymore. Williams looked down at his plate. The silence stretched long enough for Stephanie to wonder if she'd gone too far. Finally, he spoke. Work's been complicated. I know. I haven't wanted to bring it home. I didn't ask you to solve it at home. No. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his glass. You didn't. Another silence settled between them. Stephanie resisted the urge to fill it. After a few seconds, Williams stood and carried his plate to the sink. The conversation hadn't ended. It had simply stopped. Over the next several days, Stephanie asked more questions. Not accusations. Questions. How's the project coming? Busy. Still working with the same team? For the most part. Anyone new? He looked up. What do you mean? I was curious. He held her gaze for a second longer than usual. Yeah, quite a few people, actually. His answer wasn't false. It also wasn't an answer. Stephanie let it go. Later that week, she asked another. You've been spending more time downtown lately. The project's there. I know, she smiled. I was thinking maybe we could have lunch sometime while you're nearby. Williams hesitated. I'll see what my schedule looks like. You don't know? It's unpredictable. She nodded. Okay. Again, nothing he said sounded dishonest, but every conversation seemed to end with another closed door. Williams noticed the change too. One evening, while they were loading the dishwasher together, he asked without looking at her, Did I do something? Stephanie paused. What makes you ask that? You've been asking me a lot of questions. I didn't realize I needed permission. I didn't say that. She placed another plate into the rack. I'm trying to talk to my husband. He sighed. I know. Then why does it feel like every conversation stops halfway? Williams leaned both hands against the counter. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth. He looked confused. I'm telling you the truth. I didn't say you were lying. No. He looked away. But it sounds like you think I am. Neither of them raised their voices. They didn't need to. The distance between them had become loud enough on its own. The answer arrived on a rainy Tuesday, not because Stephanie searched harder, because life has a way of revealing things when people stop trying to control the timing. She was leaving a hospital after an HR partnership meeting when she recognized Williams's truck in the visitor parking lot. She checked the time. It was nearly 4. His office was 20 minutes away. For a moment she wondered if he'd come to surprise her. Then she saw him. He stepped out through the hospital entrance beside the same woman. Stephanie stayed where she was. This time, she didn't hide. Williams looked up first. The color drained from his face. Stephanie? The woman turned. Williams closed the distance between them in quick steps. What are you doing here? I had a meeting. She glanced toward the woman. So, did you? Williams opened his mouth, closed it again. The woman looked between them. I should go. No. Williams exhaled heavily. Please, don't. He looked back at Stephanie. I think it's time. The woman walked over slowly. She offered a tentative smile. You must be Stephanie. Stephanie nodded once. I'm Ava. Williams looked exhausted. Not guilty. Exhausted. There are things I should have told you weeks ago. Stephanie folded her arms. I'm listening. Williams glanced toward the hospital entrance before speaking. My older brother Marcus. He stopped. Stephanie frowned. What about Marcus? Marcus had died almost 9 years earlier. She'd never met him. She only knew the stories. He had a daughter. Stephanie stared at him. What? Williams nodded slowly. Ava is her legal guardian. Stephanie looked at Ava. Ava spoke gently. Marcus and I were close friends. Williams continued. Before he died, he asked me to look out for her if she ever needed anything. Stephanie felt the words arrive one at a time. I didn't know she existed. I know. I've never heard her name. I know. Williams looked down. A few months ago. He swallowed. Ava called. The girl, Marcus's daughter, had recently developed a serious heart condition. Insurance delays, legal complications, medical decisions. Ava had been trying to keep everything together by herself. Williams had stepped in to help navigate finances, lawyers, specialists, and hospital appointments. Stephanie looked toward the hospital entrance. Everything suddenly fit together. The downtown meetings, the late nights, the phone calls, the folders, the conference, the coffee, the hospital. None of it had been an affair. Williams spoke carefully. I didn't tell you because... Then he stopped. I kept thinking once things settled down, I'd explain everything. Ava looked down. I'm sorry. Stephanie turned to her. You didn't do anything. No, Williams said quietly. I did. They didn't drive home together. Stephanie needed time. Williams understood without asking. When he arrived an hour later, she was sitting on the back patio with 2 untouched mugs of tea. He walked outside. Can I sit? She nodded. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Not empty. Waiting. Finally, Stephanie asked, Why didn't you trust me? Williams looked at the mug in his hands. It wasn't about trust. Then what was it? He let out a slow breath. My brother spent years protecting everyone. She waited. When he got sick. Williams looked toward the yard. He never asked for help until there wasn't any time left. Stephanie listened without interrupting. I told myself I wasn't going to burden you. She blinked. Burden me? You already carry enough. Williams gave a tired smile. Long hours. Everyone else's problems at work. So, you decided I couldn't handle yours. I thought I was helping. Stephanie looked at him for a long moment. You know what hurts? He nodded faintly. I think I do. No. She shook her head. It isn't that there was another woman. Williams closed his eyes briefly. It's that you lived part of your life without me. The words settled between them. I would have gone to those appointments with you. She continued. I would have sat beside that little girl. I would have helped Ava. You never even gave me the chance. Williams stared at the ground. I know. Stephanie's voice stayed calm. Do you know what I spent weeks believing? He didn't answer. I kept wondering whether you were falling in love with someone else. His face tightened. And every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. She swallowed. You made it easier to doubt myself than to trust you. Williams covered his face with both hands. I'm sorry. The apology sounded smaller than she'd expected. Not because it lacked sincerity, because he knew it couldn't repair what silence had done. After several moments, he lowered his hands. I need to tell you something. She waited. I don't know when I stopped talking. He gave a quiet, embarrassed laugh. Maybe after Marcus died. Maybe after work got busier. I kept convincing myself I'd tell you later. Later became months. Then years. Stephanie nodded. I did the same thing. He looked up. She offered a tired smile. I stopped asking. I kept accepting busy as an answer. I confused living together with knowing each other. Williams reached across the small table. This time, when he took her hand, it wasn't to reassure her. It was because he didn't know what else to do. She let him hold it. Not because everything was fixed. Because letting go wasn't what she wanted either. The tears that finally came weren't about Ava, or Marcus, or the woman outside the cafe. They were for the years they'd spent protecting each other from burdens that marriage was meant to carry together. Neither of them had betrayed their vows. But somewhere along the way, they'd quietly abandoned the habit of letting the other person into their inner world. And that loneliness had come closer to ending their marriage than an affair ever could. The conversation on the patio changed everything. It also solved almost nothing. The next morning still came. Alarm clocks still rang. Traffic still stretched across Los Angeles before sunrise. William still left for work carrying too much on his shoulders. Stephanie still spent her days helping other people navigate difficult conversations. The difference was that neither of them pretended one emotional night had repaired years of quiet distance. A week later, Stephanie found a business card on the kitchen counter. Marriage and family therapist. She looked at Williams. "You called?" He nodded. "I almost didn't." She picked up the card. "I've never done counseling before." "Neither have I." She smiled faintly. "You nervous?" He let out a short laugh. "Terrified. So am I." The first session was uncomfortable in ways Stephanie hadn't expected. The therapist didn't ask who was right. She asked simpler questions. "When did you stop feeling emotionally known?" Neither answered immediately. Williams rubbed his palms together. Stephanie stared at the rug. Finally she admitted, "I don't know when it happened." Williams nodded. "I don't either." The therapist waited. People paid therapists to fill silence. This one didn't. Eventually Williams spoke again. "I thought protecting my wife meant keeping heavy things away from her." Stephanie looked at him. "I thought loving my husband meant not adding to his stress." The therapist smiled gently. "So you both protected each other into loneliness." Neither argued. Because it was true. Progress came in uneven pieces. Some evenings they talked for an hour. Other nights, they barely managed 10 minutes before someone said the wrong thing or ran out of words. Once, William stopped halfway through explaining a difficult meeting. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this." Stephanie looked up from the dishes. "Because I asked." He smiled. "I guess I forgot what that felt like." There were setbacks too. One afternoon, Williams canceled dinner because of an emergency at work. Stephanie felt the old worry rise before she even realized it. She picked up her phone. Instead of imagining the worst, she called him. He answered on the second ring. "You okay?" "I wanted to hear your voice." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm at the site." "I figured. I'll video call you in 5 minutes." He did. She saw steel beams behind him, workers in hard hats, dust on his sleeves. Nothing dramatic happened during that call. It lasted less than 3 minutes. But afterward, she realized how many fears disappear when people stop filling silence with assumptions. They also began visiting Ava and Marcus's daughter together. The little girl, Emma, was shy the first few times Stephanie came to the hospital. She hid behind a coloring book while Williams helped arrange paperwork with doctors. One afternoon, Emma looked up. "Are you Uncle Will's wife?" Stephanie smiled. "I am." Emma considered that. "You laugh nicer than he does." Williams looked offended. "I laugh fine." Emma shook her head seriously. "No." Stephanie laughed. Williams sighed dramatically. "I've been replaced." For the first time in months, laughter came easily. Not because life had become simple, because they were finally living inside the same reality again. The biggest changes weren't dramatic enough for photographs. No surprise vacations, no grand speeches, no expensive jewelry. Instead, ordinary life slowly became different. Williams stopped bringing his laptop to the dinner table. The first evening he left it in his office, Stephanie noticed immediately. "You forgot something." He looked toward the hallway. "No." "You sure?" He smiled. "I'm trying something." Dinner lasted almost an hour. They talked about work, movies, Emma's latest obsession with dinosaurs, an elderly neighbor who insisted every squirrel in the neighborhood belonged to him. None of it changed the world. It changed theirs. Evening walks returned. Years earlier they'd wandered through the neighborhood after dinner almost every weekend. Somehow they'd stopped. Neither remembered why. Now they started again. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. The silence felt different. It wasn't avoiding conversation. It was resting inside it. One evening, William stopped in front of a small bakery. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Stephanie looked at him. "What? What happened to that coworker?" He frowned, trying to remember. "The one whose son kept getting suspended?" Stephanie laughed. "You remembered him? You talked about him for weeks." She smiled. He graduated. Williams grinned. That's good. She looked at him for a second. Months earlier, he probably wouldn't have remembered the story at all. Not because he didn't care, because he hadn't left room in his mind for anyone else's life. Questions slowly returned to their marriage. Real ones, not logistical ones. How are you holding up? What's been on your mind lately? What are you worried about? What made you laugh today? Sometimes the answers lasted 30 seconds, sometimes an hour. Neither expected every conversation to be meaningful. They simply stopped assuming there would always be another time. One Saturday morning, Williams wandered into the kitchen looking frustrated. Stephanie looked up from making coffee. Lost your keys? He froze. Maybe. She pointed toward the top shelf above the microwave. He stared. They're there again? They're there again. He laughed. I honestly don't understand how you do that. I've had years of practice. He walked over and kissed her forehead. Some gestures never disappeared. Others simply recovered the meaning they'd quietly lost. Nearly 6 months later, another ordinary Tuesday arrived. Stephanie left work early after an unexpected cancellation. She smiled when she realized she was driving through the same part of downtown where everything had begun. For a second, the memory returned. The elevator, the glass doors, Williams laughing, the cafe. It still hurt to remember, not because she'd been wrong about an affair, because she now understood how close two people could come to losing each other without either one intending to. She reached a red light, picked up her phone, and called him. Williams answered before the second ring. Hey, you busy? I've got about 20 minutes before my next meeting. She smiled. I'm nearby. There was a short pause. Then he asked the question she'd once hoped to hear. Want coffee? I was hoping you'd say that. I'll text you the cafe. I know the one. He laughed softly. I figured you might. When Stephanie walked through the cafe door this time, Williams was already waiting. He stood as soon as he saw her. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He wrapped her in an easy hug. You beat me here. I skipped one red light. You ran it? I skipped waiting. He smiled. I married a dangerous woman. They ordered coffee, found a table by the window. For a while, they watched people hurry past outside. Williams took a sip. You know. He glanced toward the sidewalk. I think about that afternoon sometimes. So do I. I wish I'd told you everything sooner. I know. She reached across the table. I wish I'd asked sooner. He nodded. Neither of them tried to decide whose mistake mattered more. Marriage had stopped feeling like a courtroom. It felt like a conversation again. Outside, pedestrians crossed the street exactly as they had months earlier. Someone laughed near the entrance. A woman brushed lint from her coworker's jacket without thinking. Stephanie noticed. Then she smiled to herself. Not every ordinary gesture carries betrayal. Sometimes it carries nothing at all. Sometimes the dangerous thing isn't what we see. It's the silence that keeps us from asking about it. Williams reached for her hand across the table. This time there was no uncertainty in the gesture, no hidden burden, no unanswered question waiting at home. Only two people who had learned, later than they wished, that love isn't protected by never hurting each other. It's protected by refusing to let silence become more comfortable than honesty. And looking back now, Stephanie realizes the afternoon she believed her marriage was beginning to fall apart wasn't the day she lost trust in Williams. It was the day she discovered that trust isn't something you build once and keep forever. It's something you choose again every ordinary day, especially when life gives you every reason to stop asking the questions that keep two people truly known by each other. The end.